Welcome everybody, this is Kevin Miller again, President of Vision Bound International. Welcoming you to a webinar, one of our first webinars in the series of 10 or 12 about how to become an effective leader. And I hope that you were able to watch the introduction video first so that you know about the tools. We're back in my garage. We're talking about the tools that we need to be a great leader. And if you remember, I talked about we're trying to fill your leadership toolbox. So this webinar is about becoming an effective listener. Folks, there's hardly anything that you can do more in your life to be successful as a business person, in a marriage, in a family, with friends, than becoming a great listener. And there's a big difference between hearing and listening. I think you know that. I can hear you, I can hear a customer and not really listen to them. So in this webinar, we're going to learn about the power of empathic listening, of listening deeply enough to really understand. And that is what builds relationships. In fact, if I could make a couple of analogies, being a great listener is like applying Miracle-Gro. This is a fertilizer that I use in my garden, Miracle-Gro, because every time I put it on my plants, they grow better. Well, this is like listening. It's like Miracle-Gro for your relationships and your business. The more you listen, the more things grow, the more that relationships grow. So again, it's symbolic, but it is a tool to put in your toolbox to be a great listener. So I also want to make the analogy that listening is so important that it's like a power tool. It works for everything. It makes everything better. So listen to what happens when I use this power tool. That is what listening does. Listening provides a way for you to get through things, get things done quicker, but most importantly, it builds relationships. The problem is that listening requires a discipline on our part. We have to learn to close our ears and open our hearts. Well, we keep our ears open, but we keep our heart open, and we try to listen empathically. Now, what we're going to learn is there's different types of listening for different situations. If it's just facts that people want, just listen for the facts that they need and give them the facts. But if there's emotion involved, you need to listen with empathy, to listen deeply and understanding. The problem is that we sometimes get our ears plugged. And here's some Q-tips. And what that means is that we get our ears so full of stuff of our own that nobody's words can get through. So we have to clean that out and clean out our own thoughts sometimes to listen the type of listening that we really need to get the job done. So welcome to this workshop on effective listening. It's a tool to put in your toolbox. And so let's proceed and learn about listening. Thank you very much. And I will come back again after we watch the slides. Thank you. Kevin Miller again, Vision Bound International, and a part of Interweave Solutions. Thank you. This is Kevin Miller, President of Vision Bound International, and I'm delighted to present to you a webinar on one of the most important topics you will ever master in your professional and personal lives. So please listen carefully. Now, why would I say that? Becoming an effective listener is a key to building positive relationships with everyone, personally and professionally, like I said. So please download the handout and print it off if you can, but if not, you will see images of it appear on the screen. So let's go ahead and continue. So the question is, are we hearing or really listening? And there's a big difference. I can hear you, but not really listen to you. And that is what we're going to learn today, is how do we turn regular hearing into effective listening? Now, the problem is when many people think of listening, I know what I do, I think of ears. Listening is listening with your ears. But actually, listening is much deeper than that. In fact, we can learn something from the Chinese character for listening. Take a look at this screen. When a Chinese person sees the word listen, they see a combination of several things. Ears, you're paying attention to not just the words, but the tone. The eyes, you're checking body language and reassuring that they have your attention. Your mind, you're listening and staying open-minded. Your heart, you're empathizing and showing compassion as you listen. And focus, undivided attention, and focus on the other person while listening. Notice that that is the purple arrow. It's coming out. You've got to give undivided attention, which means you put down the smartphone. You turn your eyes away from the computer screen or the TV, and you give them undivided attention with your ears, your eyes, your mind, and your heart. This is the kind of listening that we're talking about in this webinar. Dr. Stephen R. Covey wrote a wonderful book called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and you may want to get that book someday, one of the great books ever written. And he said, we create many negative situations by simply assuming that our expectations are self-evident and that they are clearly understood and shared by other people. And folks, I know I do that. I just assume that my expectations are very self-evident to everyone else, and they're not. They're not being clearly understood and shared. So that is where effective listening comes in. So please follow along on page 2. And I'm going to read this to you, and I want you to be thinking about it. When I ask you to listen to me and you start giving advice, you have not done what I asked. When I ask you to listen to me and you begin telling me why I shouldn't feel that way, you're trampling on my feelings. When I ask you to listen to me and you feel you must do something to solve my problem, you have failed me, strange as that may seem. Listen. All I ask was that you listen. Not talk or do, just hear me. Advice is cheap. 50 cents will get you 2 advice columns in the same newspaper. And I can do for myself. I'm not helpless, maybe discouraged and faltering, but not helpless. When you do something for me that I can and need to do for myself, you contribute to my fear and weakness. But when you accept as a simple fact that I do feel what I feel, no matter how irrational, then I can quit trying to convince you and get about the business of understanding what's behind this irrational feeling. And when that's clear, the answers are obvious and I don't need advice. Irrational feelings make sense when we understand what's behind them. So please listen and just hear me. And if you want to talk, wait a few minutes for your turn and I'll listen to you. My friends, this page is very powerful, especially that idea when we do for people what they can do for themselves, we weaken them. If we routinely do for our children what they can and need do for themselves, we will weaken them. And it's the same with our customers or anyone else in our lives. We just need to listen and try to deeply appreciate and understand what they're saying. So here's an interesting statement. I know you believe you understand what you think I said, but I'm not sure you realize that what you heard is not what I meant. I do this all the time, folks. I think it's just, I talk and I think people understand what I said, but I don't know if that's really true. So we're going to learn how to listen in a way that the other person really feels understood and we get to what we really need to. So a really good way to look at this is this basic communication model. There's the sender and the receiver and the message. The sender has to encode the message before he or she sends it. And how do they encode it? Well, they encode it through their experiences, emotions, paradigms, which is your frame of reference. Your language can be verbal and nonverbal, culture, religion, upbringing, attitudes, age and demographics, and many other things. So the sender encodes it and sends it. It can be sent verbally, it can be sent electronically, but best in this situation is verbally. But then the problem is the receiver now has to decode it. And they're going to decode it through a different set of experiences and emotions and paradigms and language and culture and attitudes and age and demographics and other things. So you've got the sender encoding, the receiver decoding, the message is sent, however, but this is where the problem gets messed up. What the person intended to send in code is not decoded properly unless you use feedback. So feedback is when the sender and receiver, 2 ways, say things like, this is what I think I heard you say. Is that correct?
Am I understanding it correctly? Let me repeat back to you. And the sender and the receiver go back and forth until they have the same message going across and understood. Now, the problem is that some leaders become authoritarian. Authoritarian leaders believe he or she has the answers and knows what's best. I win, you lose. Tells people what to do. Look at the faces of the people around the table while the authoritarian leader is just laying it out to them. And this is actually a very terrible way to parent, to be an authoritarian parent. So this is not an effective thing. Now, when it's an emergency situation, of course, sometimes you have to jump in there and take charge. And I'll be doing a webinar on leadership later. But here's a funny cartoon. So this boss is saying, all those in favor say aye. And everybody's saying, aye, 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 aye. But what are they thinking? Say it ain't so. You've got to be kidding. Perish the thoughts. Heaven forbid. No, no, 1,000 times no. So no one is really agreeing with him, but because he is in such a powerful position and has been an authoritarian leader, they all are just saying what they think he wants to hear. This is not healthy. So what we all want to do, my friends, is become servant leaders. A servant leader believes that the team is better off with everyone's ideas, which is true. The servant leader asks for ideas and input and really listens to others. And together the team can agree on the best ideas. Now, it's obvious that servant leadership takes more time, and that's why I say if it's an emergency situation, it may not apply. But whenever possible, folks, if you want a good solution and teamwork, you become a servant leader. He that is greatest among you, let him be the servant of all. So in that book I mentioned by Stephen R. Covey, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, there are 5 habits, and habit 5 is seek first to understand, then to be understood. So you want to seek first to understand the other person before you try to be understood. Very powerful habit, and one that you want to learn, and I'm going to talk about it more in this webinar. So when should the leader talk? So here's a question. In a meeting, when discussing a problem or making a decision, when should the leader give his or her ideas? Choice number 1, at the beginning, right when you start to talk about the problem. Choice number 2, in the middle of the discussion, or choice number 3, at the end, after everyone else has had a chance to participate. And I think you can agree that number 3 is generally the best. The leader gives his or her input and ideas at the end, because everybody else needs to feel safe and they need to be able to participate, and the leader needs to listen. Because sometimes the leader will attempt to give an idea, and he might even say, this is just an idea, I have a thought here, but everybody will think that's what he wants to do. So a leader has to be very careful not to jump in with ideas and things in the middle or at the beginning. This is generally true. So I one time learned something from a woman. She had been married to her husband for like 50 years. They were like 70 years old. And she told me that my husband was a rancher and he was very much a problem solver. And she said sometimes he would come in from the field, and we had like 8 children, and he would just jump in and try to solve problems, when that's not what I needed. So she said, I made a light switch. Literally, folks, she went down to a hardware store and bought a light switch. And she wrote, light switch up, please listen to me. Light switch down, help me solve my problems. So when he came in from the field, this was sitting there on the counter. Light switch up, he knew all she needed was to him to listen to her. If the light switch was down, help me solve my problem. So he might say, honey, what do you need? Can I feed the kids? Can I take them out to play? And she would say, yes, that would be helpful. But if the light switch is up, he would just listen. In fact, they had chairs that they called listening chairs. He'd sit down in one, she'd sit down to the other, and he said, tell me what's on your mind. The light switch is up. Please listen to me. Folks, it might be something that you could use in meetings or in your relationships. I love the idea. In fact, I made one myself. So anyway, so now I want you to read along to this a little bit too, these quotes. When listening is the best remedy to loneliness, loquaciousness, and laryngitis. Wisdom is the reward you get for a lifetime of listening when you would have preferred to talk. Friends are those rare people who ask how we are and then wait to hear the answer. The golden rule of friendship is to listen to others as you would have them listen to you. The most important thing to communicate is to hear what isn't being said. Listen, or thy tongue will keep thee deaf. Wherefore, my beloved brethren, if any man be swift to hear, let everyone be swift to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath. That's in the Bible. So finally, at this page 3, we see that we spend a lot of time listening, almost about 42%, talking 33%, reading and writing much less. But the problem is there is a thought-speech differential. What that means is that you can listen a lot faster than I am talking right now, because the average speaking speed is about 150 to 350 words per minute, but you can listen more than twice that fast. And so what we do is we fill in that spare time with distractions. Our brain goes off to some other place while the person is talking. So to listen effectively, we've got to watch that thought-speech differential, slow down the brain, and listen carefully. So here's some principles at the bottom of page 3. We listen actively. We listen for the total meaning, and it might be nonverbal, it might be verbal. Listen with empathy, which we'll talk about. Listen with an open mind, not judging, not closed down, and listen critically. Now that doesn't mean to criticize, it just means you listen with an ear to really understand and not jump in. So we're going to learn more about this in the rest of this webinar. So on the next page, page 4, we first of all need to be a prepared listener. We need to be aware that each one of us has a default listening style. And it's one that we might get from the time we're children. We might even pick it up from our parents. But do we tend to be impatient? Are we anxious to solve problems? So here are some things that you might think about. Are you a prober, where you ask a lot of questions? Are you an interpreter, where you try to interpret what the person is saying? Do you rehearse everything as they're saying it? Are you a dreamer? Are you a comparer, where you're trying to compare what their life is, what they're saying, to what your experience is? Sometimes you might even be a sparrer, where you kind of almost joust with them, so to speak. Or you derail them. They talk about one thing and you take them off on another tangent. Or maybe you're a placater, where you, oh, that's okay, that's all right. Or a mind reader. Oh, I know what you're thinking. Anyway, these are some things about to be careful of. I know that I'm a derailer sometimes. I know that I'm an interpreter sometimes. I know that sometimes I can even try to placate when all I really should do is listen. So be aware of that. So I love this. Stop, look, and listen. And I want everybody to say that. Stop, look, and listen. Say it again. Stop, look, and listen. Stop what you're doing. Turn and look at the person and listen with your eyes as well as with your ears. Now this is a little bit cultural. In some cultures, it's a little invasive to look too deeply at someone. So you have to adjust this to the culture that you're in. But generally, stop, look, and listen. The second key is you got to determine what kind of listening is required, because it might be listening for enjoyment, like when you listen to the radio or the TV. You might be listening for content, facts, and information. In this case, the emotion is low. But listening to validate and give emotional help, this happens when the emotion is high. So it's different types of listening. So the third key is to adjust your listening style to the need at hand. If the emotion is low, like it says on page 4, you listen attentively with an active mind and grasp the content of what the message is. The emotion is low. There's just, like you might say, what are the sales figures for last month? There's not a lot of emotion there. You just need the number. But when the emotion is high, and this is very important at the bottom, you check your autobiography at the door. You set your story, your autobiography aside, and you listen to the other person, not just for their, and you're listening to understand, not just, and you're listening until they feel understood. not just to understand. So, now here's a little analogy. Imagine a pie. Don't throw a pie in the other person's face. Advise, probe, interpret, and evaluate. That's what a pie stands for. People aren't probably needing advice unless they asked for it, so be careful not to jump in with advice. And so probing is when you start to challenge them, leading them along like you're a lawyer or something, leading them along, giving advice, probing. So advising and probing is not necessarily a good thing to do. We'll get to some more a little bit later. 6 active listening skills then is you pay attention, you withhold judgment, you reflect back what you hear the person is saying, you clarify what you heard them say, then you summarize, and then you share to get to the ideas. So that's where that comes into play. So again, stop, look, and listen. Stop, look, and listen. That is the key. So what we need to do is master empathic listening. Now, empathic listening is a very deep type of listening. It's really seeking first to understand, then to be understood, that habit 5. Empathy is deeply feeling into what the person is saying, and it is really a critical skill. So let's learn a little bit more about empathy. So back again to page 5. Remember the probing, the pie? Advise, probe, interpret, and evaluate. So the I is to interpret, the E is to evaluate. So be very careful not to throw a pie in somebody's face. Don't give advice, don't probe, don't interpret what they're saying, and try not to evaluate. Now, if the person says, I need your input, I need you to evaluate me, then that's okay. But be very careful not to throw that pie in someone's face. I know I've done it, and I've had pies thrown in my face. So the 4th key then is to master empathic listening. This is deeper than even active listening. Active listening is the process of sending back to the receiver what the listener thinks the speaker says, both in content and feelings. It helps improve understanding, and it shows interest and respect, and it validates everyone's feelings, and allows an elaboration and further exploration of feelings. And it prompts the listener to go deeper into your own mind. This is active listening. But empathic listening is even a higher form of listening than active listening. It requires you to really delve in to the other person until they feel understood. It precludes autobiographical listening of any sort. And it encourages an empathy, deeply understanding. So really, the definition of validation is being able to empathetically listen and understand another person's point of view without having to change it. That's the key, folks. Validation, you're not trying to change it. You're just trying to empathetically listen and really understand what the other person's view is and what they're saying. So there's things to do to validate with questions. There's questions and responses. Now let me tell you, the questions are the best because the questions open up the other person and allow them to speak and say what they need. So really powerful one there. Please help me understand. This is one of the best things to say to keep them listening and talking, I mean. How did you feel about that? And they might go, I was hurt, I was scared. And then you might say, well, what did you do? And then you can go into a little deeper. What would you like to do? What do you think caused the problem? What did you think when it happened? Are there any other options? What do you think the outcome will be? What would you like me to do? Would it help if I took the kids out to play? Would it help if I helped you with the dishes? Anything, but you're just using questions to try to keep them talking. Now, validating responses is really powerful. In this case, you're not judging, you're not probing, you're just saying, I'll bet that's hard. You see, that's not a question. I'll bet that's hard. So if your teenager comes in and says, my boyfriend broke up with me, you say, I'll bet that's hard. Or they come in and say, "School was so hard today, Dad." That must be frustrating. You see, these are just validating responses, and it can happen with a customer too. When somebody's having a problem with your product, wow, I'll bet that's hard. That must be frustrating. Now, the third one is very important, my friends. I think I might have felt the same way. Never ever say, "Oh, I felt the same way." No two people have ever felt exactly the same way about anything. No two people have ever felt exactly the same way. So all you can say is, "I think I might have felt the same way," and listen to my tone. I think I might have felt the same way. What a difficult position to be in. What a good way to handle that situation. "Oh, no, I know how that much meant to you." That's got to be a real challenge. I'll bet you miss her. That's an awkward situation to be in. I'm so sorry that happened to you. Folks, I could share a personal story about this. When I was 17, the girl that I was dating with, one morning, she just dumped me. She had her friend come and tell me that this girl, whose name was Debbie, didn't ever want to see me again. And folks, my world fell apart that day. In fact, I didn't even go to school. I just drove around in my car crying and trying to understand what happened. So I went home and I didn't eat dinner. My dad and mom knew something was wrong. And I just went into my bedroom and I crawled into bed. And I was crying alone. And my father, Frank Miller, quietly opened the door, and he came in and got in bed and held me tight. I don't think I've ever been held that tightly by anyone. He just put his arms around me and held me, and he didn't say anything. He just let me cry, and I cried harder and harder, and he just held me. And then finally, when I quit crying a little bit, he got out of bed and he said, "My son, I love you. And I promise you, the sun will come out. It will come out. It will be better." And he walked out of my room. And you know what? The sun did come out the next morning. I got up, went to school, saw my girlfriend with her new boyfriend, and my life went on because I knew that someone validated and understood how much I was in pain. That was the best example I personally had of validation. So, this "please tell me more" is a very powerful one. Please tell me more. And then the person will share a little more and you say, "Please tell me more." Notice it's not a question, it's a statement. "Please tell me more." And the person hopefully will open up. Now, if they shut down, then you might use some of those other questions that I showed you. How did you feel about that? What can I do to help? But "please tell me more" is a very powerful one. It's not shutting anyone down. It's not judging them. It's just letting them talk. Please tell me more. One time I was in a prison visiting prisoners with Dr. Covey. And I saw him use this so powerfully with this one prisoner who he would just listen to the man. And the man kept saying all these kinds of things. And Stephen just looked kindly at him and said, "Please tell me more." In fact, I remember one thing. The man said, "Mr. Covey, you don't understand. If they let me out of prison today, I've got to commit another crime to get back in." And Stephen just looked kindly at him and said, "Please tell me more." And he said, "Well, the guys whose drug deal went bad think I'm holding off on the money. And they said that they would get me as soon as I got out of prison, and I need to tell them where the money is." And he said, "I don't have that money." And then he said, "Not only that, but my uncle told me if he ever sees me again, he'll kill me." And then he said, "Mr. Covey, you see, prison is outside these walls. Safety is inside." Now that, my friends, is what you call a paradigm shift. To that man, prison was the safest place for him to be. But Stephen didn't judge him. He just said, "Please tell me more." And so the warden who ran the prison came up to him and he said, "Why is that man talking so much? I can't get that prisoner to ever say anything to me. What is Dr. Covey doing?" And I said, "It's not what he's doing, It's what he's not doing. He's not judging. He's not probing. He's not interpreting. He's not evaluating. Maybe for the first time in that other man's life, there's someone who cares to really understand. And all Stephen ever said was, please tell me more. So that is a very, very powerful statement, folks, to use. Try to use it. Please tell me more. Please tell me more. So let's go back to validation. What does it really mean to validate someone? Now, I know this definition is a little wordy, but validation means that we're acknowledging another person's emotions, thoughts, experiences, values, and beliefs. Validation is essential to meaningful connection, and it communicates to the other person, you are important, our relationship matters. That's simply what validation is doing. It's not trying to fix, it's not trying to give advice. It's just, you are important, our relationship matters to me. And I think that's what my father did. He just told me he loved me and held me, and it got better. So as we are continuing out, there's a little understanding continuum. And on the left, we have low attentiveness to high attentiveness. And over time is the axis along the bottom. The problem is, and this happens to me, I will be very attentive for a few moments. For instance, if my wife comes to talk to me, and all of a sudden I've got the gist of it, which means, aha, I know what she's going to say. I got it. I want you to remember, resist the gist. Don't follow that gist. Because what happens is the attention drops way down while we prepare our response. The other person is continuing to talk, and we're not listening because we're preparing our response. So then their attention goes way up because the other person needs to give us a period, a comma, a semicolon, a breath, and then we jump in with our advice, our probe, our interpreting, our evaluating. In the meantime, the person senses that we're not really listening. They can see it in our eyes. They know we've gone off preparing our own response. And folks, that is why communication breaks down. It's because people are not staying with listening long enough to let the other person really express what they're thinking. This is very, very important with your customers. The customers will talk to you, and don't jump in quickly to prepare your answer. Oh, you need to buy this product. Instead, continuing to listen to them, understand them, tell me more. And then finally, it might be time for you to jump in when they request it and offer some solutions. So there's another diagram that has been helpful to me a long time. And it has to do whether the emotion is low or high. So on the left, you've got low emotion to high emotion. And your process going across the bottom is a little different. And so what you're doing is you're listening. If their emotion is high, you need to listen until they feel understood. Not listen to understand. When the emotion is low, you listen to understand. Okay, the person comes in and says, what were the sales figures last month? And you say, oh, it was $10,000. Okay, they walk away happy. They didn't have a big emotional issue. So you listen with your ears and brain. But if they come in with high emotion, then you listen with your eyes, heart, and spirit, like we talked about. And you listen with your ears and brain, but your eyes and your heart, until they feel understood. Now, once someone feels understood, then their emotion will come down. That's what that arrow is on the right. And when their emotion comes down and they feel understood, then you might be able to give them the answer that they want. Or maybe they'll just walk away because they felt understood. That's all they really needed. So this is a very powerful model for you to think about. And you might even print it off and put it on your wall. Listen until they feel understood if the emotion is high. If the emotion is low, you just seek to understand. So once again, these are the validating responses. I'll bet that's hard. That must be frustrating. I think I might have felt the same way. What a difficult position to be in. What a good way to handle that situation. Oh no, I know how much that meant to you. That's got to be a real challenge. I bet you'll miss her. What an awkward situation to be in. I'm so sorry that happened to you. Those are just some more validating responses. Questions again. How did you feel about that? Do you feel I understand? What did you do? Then what did you say? What would you like to do? What do you think caused the problem? What did you think when it happened? Are there other options? What do you think the outcome will be? What would you like me to do? Would it help if I? Now this is where it's tricky because you don't want to jump in with too much advice, but if it's obvious that the person could use some help. For instance, if you come in and your spouse is busy making dinner or whatever, then you would say, would it help if I took the kids out to play? Would it help if I set the table? Name something you can do. And this shows respect, and it leaves it open to the other person. So, folks, that is where we're at. This is about a half an hour in, and we're going to try to keep these webinars to about a half an hour. But remember that you can pause them, rewind them, and listen for a little more, and come back to them. And so the next webinar that I want to do, one of the next ones, will be on resolving conflict. And you'll notice that effective listening is the key to resolving conflict. Conflict is just a disagreement with people. It isn't bad or good, it's just a disagreement. So you need to identify the problem, and that requires the listening that we talked about. Really identify the real problem, the deeper problem. Then you identify the root cause. And this might require active listening as well, where you'd say, what do you think caused that? Why is the conflict occurring? Then you identify possible solutions. And you can do this with the other person. And if they run out of ideas, you can offer them. But you want to remember that the relationship is far more important. Then you implement the solution, and then you track and evaluate the solution. So watch for the webinar that I will do on resolving conflict.
Okay, everybody, I hope you were able to learn something about effective listening from those slides and so forth. And I hope that you've come up with a plan. Now remember, there's a handout packet that you were supposed to print out, if you possibly could, to guide you in this workshop. The handout packet has a page at the end about an action plan on how to be a more effective listener. So I hope that some of the things you learned gave you ideas on how to be a better listener at home, at work, with your friends, because listening is indeed that power tool that I mentioned, and it is one of the most important skills to put in your leadership toolbox. Again, Kevin Miller, thank you for watching and being a part of the Interweave Solutions Virtual Leadership Series. Bye.